I recently read this short story, The Country Doctor by Kafka, and it is a magical realism story, and it is horrifyingly scary, and it is about oppression, and it is about, I think totalitarianism, but it's just done through the magic of a man turning into a horse, and I think for these times, when we are living in, very unstable times, when we see the dangers of not thinking deeply, of not being critical, when we, talk about things like walls, we need a magic. We need something that is going to get us through the easy thinking of racism and hatred. We need to see through that to a deeper and more complex truth where we can change things. And my hope really is that, and it remains to be seen, except we do see it with Kafka, that stories can change people really deeply inside them, and that maybe we can get through this and create a resistance to the terrible times we see unfolding, a resistance that will bring people together and make them recognize their neighbors and, extend a hand. When there is an oppression of the truth, sometimes people can get around that oppression. When people are trying to alter the facts, sometimes we can get around that by making things metaphorical. And those metaphors can sometimes crack through the silence that's being imposed. And I think that's why we see magic realism coming up when people are being pressed down and made to be quiet. Well, I think in the 70s there was a whole cultural renaissance in Newfoundland, and we had actually an explosion of theater, and it was collectively written theater, and it went all over Canada, and it went to Europe, and it was Codco and the Mummers, and it was very politically driven. It was acerbic and hilariously funny, and it had it really gave a slightly younger generation the opportunity to recognize a unique voice. And so in the 80s, you saw an explosion of literature from Newfoundland. So we have Bernice Morgan, Michael Crummey, Michael Winter, Larry Matthews, Claire Wilkshire. We just had all these writers coming out of Newfoundland, Helen Porter, telling the story of that place, because it's a very unique place. And then there are all these outports in Newfoundland that could only be accessed by boat sometimes. So a rich language grew up in those places that, we have our own English dictionary, Newfoundland dictionary with just a vocabulary that is tremendously rich. And there's a rich storytelling, oral storytelling culture, and music, like music that is 400 years old, that has been passed down from generation to generation in those small communities. And there's also a culture, it's very much like the relationship that Tasmania has to the rest of Australia, which is we were sort of the poor cousins of Canada, and often the joke of Canada. And but then, of course, we went through an oil boom, which has become an oil bust. But just with that 70s resurgence of a pride in the culture, I think Canada had to sit up and take notice. So there's a kind of resistance to the dominant narrative in Newfoundland. I was living in Toronto at the time, so far away from home, and Toronto seemed to me a really big city. And I was literally getting lost in that city quite often. And someone from home told me that this literary journal had come out with my story in it. And I found that almost impossible to believe, that in this big city, I would find a part of myself. And I went into that bookstore, my husband came with me, and it was pouring rain, and it was bright fluorescent lights, and I sloshed over to the literary journal section. And when I saw it, I realized that just the power of something that had been so deeply inside of me, now available to readers. And that was a really, it really altered my understanding of what a story could be. It was something that could be deeply felt and intimate and shared. Yes, well, so I wrote a book called February, which is about the sinking of the Ocean Ranger, an oil rig that sank off the coast of Newfoundland in 1982, and everybody on it died. And that rig, it sank because profit was privileged over safety, and that was why it sank. And so the whole island felt the grief of that moment, and we still feel it. 30 years later, it's still deeply felt. For every year since the Ocean Ranger sank, the names of the men who died on that rig were read out on the CBC as a kind of memorial. So it is not something that's ever gone away, because I think people had a great deal of hope about the oil industry, and we saw in that moment how dangerous it was. I had lost my own father when I was 16 through natural causes. He had a brain aneurysm and he died without any warning at all. And so when I came to write that book, I thought I knew everything there was to know about grief. But what I had to learn was that, I had to explore the memories of those feelings in order to write the book, and the trauma of the loss. And what I recognized is that there is something powerful about allowing yourself to feel that sadness, even while you're going on about your life and feeling, the joy of living, of having children, of writing, of all those things. It's important to recognize that we're complex beings and not to be afraid of those emotions, because that is it's the complexity of everything we feel that makes us human, I think.